Well, I'm really bummed this morning because I'm told I got to stay right here. And I'm a roamer. My mother-in-law, when I first started preaching, I would just pace from one end to the other. And she wanted somebody to get a chain and put on me so I would stay still. So you guys have done that for me. Maybe we'll see if I don't wander off sometimes. But I'd probably be right over there in some of these young men's face and be asking you to give me the answer. By the way, do you have a copy of some questions? If you don't, they haven't passed them out. Well, you guys get to work here. We need to raise our hands and get our questions handed out because we're going to have class this morning. Even if I do have to stand up here, we're still going to have class. And so if you need a pen or pencil, you kind of go ahead and raise your hand because Weston back there, he's ready with pen or pencil. And so I should have announced that last night. My grandson likes to make fun of me. He said, real men have a pocket knife in their pocket. And he said, Grandpa has a pen. So anyway, maybe I could have a pen knife. You remember those? All right. And so we're going to work together this morning and learn about a lady named Ruth. So that could be one of the things you could be working on, is trying to find where she's hiding somewhere in the Bible, a lady named. But I want to read something to you first. It's probably, this opportunity is maybe the best for me to just visit with you for a minute. I got to meet Harrison this morning, and his grandmother was explaining to him that a long, long, long time ago, I knew his dad, Jason. And so that has been a long time ago. Terry, that was 1980. 1980, we moved to a place called Greenwood, Indiana. And so we're delighted to be kind of back in the same area. Now, see, when I asked you guys Friday night about 1981, you didn't even remember 81. I was crushed, And so we're going to kind of think about where we've been over the last 45 years. I don't think the Bargersville Church existed then. But there was a place called White River that came into being about then, and it doesn't exist anymore. Local churches, they come and go. But Christ, and yes, Caleb, God does not change. And we put our trust and our reliance upon God. Okay? And so we want to think about that. So I was thinking of you as a church. I can think a long time ago coming over and talking with a guy named Sid Latham and my dear friend Clay Curtis and Brother Gregory. I just remember those days. But I'm thinking in 1 Thessalonians verse 2, it says, "We give thanks to God always for all of you, making mention of you in our prayers, constantly bearing in mind your work of faith and labor of love, and steadfastness of hope." Faith, love, and hope. Hope in our Lord Jesus Christ in the presence of our God and Father. Now, one dear brother has been encouraging me to bring the heat. And he asked this morning, he said, are you going to bring the heat this morning? I said, well, what I'm going to try to do is bring the hope. But both are needed. And God uses both the heat and the hope to help us. But what I think I see in Scripture a lot is most all of us need building up more than we need tearing down. Most all of us know we're hurting. Most all of us know we're sinners. And we need the encouragement to keep on running, whatever age we are. That's why Hebrews is such a great book. Keep your eye on Jesus and keep on running. But I see this church as a church full of faith, and I see this church full of love and hope. Hope for the future. Even though among us, there are old guys like a guy named Larry that I met 45 years ago. Oh yes, and Ellen, I met you too. And you know what? We're getting old. If you notice, I mean, my hair, can you imagine, I used to have hair kind of like down to here, and it just keeps disappearing. My grandson loves to say, you got a big forehead, Grandpa. So we're getting old, and we're dying. We are. We're in the land of, and you are too, you're in the land of the dying. And the sooner you realize you're going to die, the sooner you can start living well. So it's really important to process that. Now, as young people, you don't need to think a whole lot about death right now, but you do need to think about remembering your Creator when you're young. So we want to think together today about a wonderful love story. A lady named Ruth. Now, Ruth, I did tell you, we're going to talk about Ruth today, right? And so here we are. Was Ruth a real person? Was she a real person? Mr. Gregory, you're committing? Yes, okay, all right. And so we might want to go back and think about that. So she was a real person. So now as we do her Facebook page and we do her profile, what would we want to share about, should we call her Mrs. Ruth or Miss Ruth, or what would we be thinking about? So kind of questions like who, what, when, where. Jude, thank you very much. Andrew, thank you very much for all your help. Appreciate that. What would we want to know about her? And then maybe the more important question is, why is she in the Bible? You know, even in the Old Testament, there's some people in there you think, well, what's she doing in there? Let me give you another R lady. How about Rahab? Is she a real person? What's she doing in the Bible? And what does that have to do with me? And so is it possible that every book of the Old Testament is somehow pointing us to Jesus? Is that possible? Is it possible that Ruth is actually a document that's pointing us to Jesus? You know, probably the hardest book in the Old Testament to say that's pointing us to Jesus is, I'll let you choose whichever one you want. But when you read the Old Testament scripture, I want you to be thinking about God's telling us three things in the Bible. Someone is coming. Someone has come, and somebody's coming back or again. Now, my friend Max Villagomez, he's got that down. You know, he sees the big picture. And quite frankly, it seemed like I was maybe a senior in high school before one of our elders, Warren Price, actually helped me to see that all the Bible fits together. It's all one story. Yeah, it's all one story, and it's all about Jesus. Okay? So I want you to be thinking about Jesus as we're walking through Ruth. Now Austin has said that he's done some things to my slide. So if it's messed up, it's all his fault. You know, he said something about he's embedded something, and I'm not sure what bed he put it in, but we're going to see what we can find out as we look at the Bible Project. Anybody heard of the Bible Project? Oh, you like it? Yeah, it's pretty cool. Is it always absolutely correct? We kind of want to read it with careful eyes. But I'll tell you what, Bible Project's pretty cool, especially the old ones. You know, it's always the old ones that are the best. And so as you think about kind of narrating these pictures, we're going to try one of those. And then what you're going to do is you're going to be the critical audience to say, no, maybe, And so you're going to work through that as we walk through the text, probably of just chapters 1 and 2. Now, you young people are thinking, what's this have to do with me? This lesson is for you precisely and specifically. Because I want you to look at Ruth, and there's this guy. I don't know a lot of people with his name today, but there's this guy who I think is one of the best guys I've ever met. Don't know too much about him, but I'd say he's an outstanding man, and we need some men. So let's kind of walk through that. I'm going to push this button one more time, see what happens. And Austin's back there just praying really hard. All right? No, he's not. He's already tested. He knows it's going to work.
It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are three main characters in the book: Naomi, the widow, and Boaz, the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line, "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem. struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry two Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi. And she says, wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God. And so the two of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her, that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up, and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future. And that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story. And that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her. But actually, the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Oved, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
Stood out to you as you kept hearing him speak? What particular word maybe kept being emphasized with Ruth and Boaz? Good. Loyalty. That word is used a lot in the Old Testament. I was going to guess, I think it's over 200 times. It's the Hebrew word chesed. And God is loyal. And he wants his people to be loyal to him. And you see that in both Ruth and in Boaz. And so, young ladies, you look for a guy like Boaz. Young men, you look for a woman like Ruth, whose first loyalty is to God. In fact, what you're looking for is not somebody who loves you first and best, but what you're looking for is someone who loves God first and best. And if they're loyal to God, you have a greater confidence that they may remain loyal to you. Okay? So as we think through this, where has the family been? Where is Elimelech and Naomi when the story starts? They're in a little place called Bethlehem that's not even showing up on the map, south of Jerusalem. Bethlehem. Okay? So let's start walking through some questions here, writing down some answers. I just went ahead and wrote down what the Bible Project said, that God works through ordinary people to provide protection and fulfill promises. What's the time period? Go ahead and write that down. What's the time period? In the days of the judges. The days of the judges. That's our time period. And maybe some of you remember precisely when the judges ruled. Sometime after Joshua, sometime after 1400, down to maybe about 1050 or so. A long period of time, about 350 years. I don't know precisely when in the period of the judges that Ruth lived. Some people think they know almost exactly when. I don't know how to figure that out. But she's living in the days of the judges. Are those good days or bad days? Those are really dark days. In fact, when you get to chapters 17 through 21, it's some of the darkest picture of all human history. And it's the Jews and what they're doing to other people. And it's what their nations around them are doing to them. So it's really important to kind of get a picture. And where do they move over to? Is that purple? Is that I hope I'm not colorblind. Is that the king of Moab? Moab, good buddies of the Jews, yes? Maybe not so much. Moabites, were they relatives of the Jews? Yeah. You remember Moab and Ammon? Those relatives, was that Lot, I'm thinking? Yeah. And in fact, if you look in Deuteronomy 23, you would be reading that Moabites, they're not allowed in God's temple. They're not allowed in God's tabernacle for 10 generations because of how they treated the Jews as they were coming out of Egypt. So you've written down the days of the judges. Who are the members of the family? Go ahead and write that down. And the reason I'm asking you to write it down is the more senses we use in the learning process, the greater the retention. You're seeing it, you're hearing it, and you're feeling it when you're writing it. So it's really helpful to be taking notes. And so you've got Elimelech and Naomi. Anybody know what Naomi's name means? She's pleasant. Naomi. And then you got the two boys, Mahlon, and depending on whether this is a K or a CH, Chilion, I think NIV says it that way, or Chilion. So those are the two boys. Where do they live? Number 4, where do they live? They live in Bethlehem, but which one? You see, there's more than one Bethlehem in Israel. Now, you might not have known that, but there's more than one. There's one up in Zebulun. So which one is this? Bethlehem E. Do you see that there? Bethlehem Ephrathah or Ephrathah. That's the really little one down in Judah. Bethlehem Ephrathah. Bethlehem means house of, anybody know what that means? Bethlehem. House of bread. It's the house of bread, except what's not there right now? Bread, because it's a famine period. By the way, where would you read about this little Bethlehem town in a Minor Prophet? Do I have you any help with that? Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Micah 5 and verse 2. And the Jews know that even in the time when Jesus is born, they know where God has promised that the Messiah would be born. Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. And so we've got this house of bread place, and what's missing is bread. Just for you to think about, you think it was okay for them to go to Moab when there was a famine in Israel? I don't want any answers, and I don't know the answer. But I just kind of want you to think about that. This is a tough time for them. So they move to Moab, and who are the two girls that the boys marry? Orpah and Ruth. Are you guys keeping up? Yeah, you're good. Okay. All right, Orpah and Ruth. And what was it that God said about Moabites? They're not welcome. All right. And so as we think about that, they're not to enter the assembly for 10 generations. So when Naomi decides to move back to Bethlehem after the death of her husband and her sons, what does she strongly encourage these girls to do? Go back to your people, your family, and I think the text even says go back to your gods. Now, I'm really struggling with that phrase. Would Naomi ordinarily encourage them to be going back and worshiping their gods? A lot of things have gone on here, and their gods are terrible. You see, the reason God removed the Canaanites from the land, the reason he spewed them out of the land was because they were killing their children as worship to God. And this Chemosh God, and this stone here, stone of Mesha, is talking about the Moabites and how they can rise up and break the yoke of Israel. And this picture that you can see to your right is a picture of the worship of Molech, where they would just offer their children, burn them on the hot arms of this god. And you think, why would they do that? To a great extent, it's the same reason people burn their kids today. Now, I'm not trying to gross anybody out with what happens in abortion. But usually, abortion occurs for the convenience or the cover-up of the parents. And in the fertility mindset, I'll go ahead and sacrifice this one because that'll allow me to have a better job, more future. I'll be able to continue my career, and it's very much based on what I can get for myself. Now, for those of you who may have had an abortion, my heart grieves for you. And for every lady who's gone through the pain of a miscarriage, that's an extremely difficult thing. But that's two very different things. And so the desire for more stuff is basically the basis of the fertility gods. More crops, more kids, more this, more that. And so they would worship these gods. And sadly, it won't be very long before the Israelites are doing the same thing to their kids. Deuteronomy is going to speak about what will happen then. So here we are. We found Bethlehem, Judah, and we found Moab. And Ruth is going to show remarkable loyalty to Naomi and return with Naomi. Do you know what Naomi says to call herself when she gets back home? Mara. Mara. Don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. Who does she think has been using her for target practice? She thinks God is punishing her. She thinks God is just dealing out all his retribution on her, and all the bad things of her life have come because God's mad at me. God's angry with me. And so when she gets back to Bethlehem, she is bitter. Does she have a right to be bitter? Would you be bitter? If you had lost your husband, you'd lost your sons, you've lost practically everything that was meaningful to you. There's been a famine in your home. What are you supposed to do? How are you going to feed your kids? She's had to leave her hometown. Her husband has died. Her boys have died. Wouldn't you be tempted to be bitter too? I don't think we need to be too hard on this lady. And now she's losing a daughter-in-law. You know, she's telling the girls go back, but do you think maybe she kind of secretly wanted them to come with her, support her, help her, be with her? And so one of them has gone back. And so she's bitter. But I want you to look at Ruth. Does she have a reason to be bitter also? Has she had some pretty similar bad things happen to her? You know, how many kids has she had so far? How many kids did she and Mahlon have? You have chapter 4 is when you find out which boys she married. How many kids have they had? I don't know of any. Do you ever wonder if maybe she couldn't have children? Did God ever kind of close the womb of a woman for an extended period of time, and then God in his providence or miraculous power produces a baby? So don't know that she's had any children. That could be very disappointing. Now her husband's dead. And now her mother-in-law is leaving. Do you think that Ruth and Naomi had a good relationship? What do you think about that? Do you think that Ruth and Naomi got along? And do you think that Ruth realizes why the bitterness is creeping in her mother-in-law and wants to help? And so, young ladies, here's one of those takeaways. You need to look long and hard in a critical, kind way at your mother-in-law. She loves the guy you're interested in more than you do. But you need to look at her character. And young ladies, when you hear a young man say, oh, I don't want to be like my dad, you know what's typically what happens? They're a lot like their dad. And so you want to really invest a good bit of time in the relationship with your future in-laws. You want to work with them. You want to go canoeing with them. And your boyfriend, too. That's a real good test. And the other really good test, by the way, as Bob Hines said 50 years ago, is you want to do wallpapering with them. So if you're back into wallpapering, just try that together. Just try to get the rainbows to match up. And so you want to do work together, not just stare at a movie together. That's not really telling you anything about the character. But you let him have a flat tire on the interstate and see how he responds. Then you'll get an idea of who you're considering marrying. Okay? So I think Ruth really sees Naomi as a good woman, somebody that she wants to be around. So I want to suggest to you that Naomi wasn't always a bitter woman, okay? But there are some life events that can cause that. And now Naomi's leaving, and she's going back to her people. And Ruth is going to decide to leave her home. So let's read a little bit together. Here, picking up in about verse 14 of chapter 1, Naomi's caring for these girls. It's going to be really hard for you, a foreigner, to come back to Bethlehem with me. It's going to be very difficult. I'm not going to have any more children. I may never get married again. I'm certain you're not going to wait 20 years for my boys to grow up. No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you. For the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. Now verse 14. And they lifted up their voices and they wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Then she said, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Orpah's gone back to her people and her gods. Ruth, you go back. Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. Now, some of you were talking, I think maybe even yesterday, about songs that we used to sing 50 years ago at weddings. Let me give you a really old one. Whither thou goest, I will go. Old King James. Do you see the loyalty of Ruth and Naomi? The picture's not about marriage, but we certainly see that same kind of loyalty that should be manifest in marriage. And so you're noticing the commitment. Would it be possible for Ruth to be accepted in Jewish culture? What has she just done? Your God will be my God. Has she converted? I think she has. I think she's saying, the God, Yahweh, the Jehovah God, He is going to be my God. I'm going to be loyal to my God, and I'm going to be loyal to you. Could a Moabite become a child of God? Could she be accepted as one of God's people? Could a Canaanite, like Rahab, become a child of God? Yeah, you're on it. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so the picture, even in the Old Testament, is even non-Jewish people who have faith and loyalty and trust in God, they are going to be my people. We tend to forget about the riffraff that came out of Egypt along with the Israelites, the mixed multitudes. And so people who are God's people are the people who are loyal to God, who have a heart for God. And so I'm going to say something here for moms and dads. I know we want to tell our children, you need to marry a member of the church. And perhaps you've said that. Perhaps I've said that. But could I suggest to you that what you want your children to do is marry somebody who loves God first and best? Now, you realize that just because a young man or young woman goes to a church like you go to is not necessarily an indication of their trust and loyalty to God. It could be that this is what they have to do because Dad says, as long as you live under my roof, you'll go where I tell you. And so as soon as that child is out on their own, it's rebellion. You know, we can hold the top of their heads pretty well when they're little, but there comes a time when we have to take our hands off of their head and they make their own choices. And that's scary and painful. And hopefully beautiful if they have a loyal heart for God. So what we want is we want our kids to be devoted first and best to God. And we want them to find somebody who's loyal to God first and best. And that person may be on a journey to try to find out exactly what God wants them to do in their lives. Aren't we all on that journey? Trying to find out what is it that God wants me to do in my life. And so Mom and Dad, kind of think about that as you consider trying to help steer your children toward what kind of person do you want to marry. And it's kind of scary, dads, because sometimes our daughters will say, oh, well, I want to marry a man just like my dad. And sometimes we know who we are, and we think, we want you to marry somebody who's better than your dad. So Ruth's got some disappointments, and now Orpah has left. What does that mean? I've got 5 minutes left? Okay, let's kick it in gear here. So is Ruth downtrodden, or is she full of faith? She's full of faith and hope and love, and she's helping Naomi, who's dealing with all the past. We all have baggage. We're all carrying it around, and we need to be encouraged. Did you notice in the expression of Ruth the Moabite, the loyalty? Did you notice that she was of excellent character? Did you notice that Boaz was of excellent character? The very thing that's said in Proverbs 31 is what is said about Ruth. But I want you to think about Boaz for a couple minutes. Guys, what did you see in Boaz? Did you see a wealthy man? He's really rich. You notice that? Is he married? Don't think so. But he's an older guy. But I want you to think about, he's looking at this younger woman, and what does he see in this young woman? Wow. She spends 4 hours a day making sure her nails are perfect. And the other 4 hours she spends twittering or TikToking something, and she's just waiting for some man to come and take care of her. Is that what he saw in Ruth? No, he saw a young woman and said, look, I need to get out there and I need to work. You know, I need to feed me and feed you, and I'm going to get in there and get dirty, and I'm going to work hard with all the guys in the field and the maids in the field. But now I want you to look at Boaz for a minute. What does Boaz do to help this young woman who's willing to get in there and work and help provide? What does he do? He says, you stay with my girls. And I'm telling my guys to keep their hands off of you. And I'm telling my men to respect you and to provide for you. So guys, what is it what's Boaz's job here? This is a foreign girl. Let's just call her Hispanic for sake of illustration. She's a Hispanic girl. Let's just pick Ecuador, since I'm kind of into Ecuador right now. And she's from Ecuador. And what's a good, godly man going to do with a young lady who's coming to America to try to provide for herself and her family? What's a guy going to do? He's going to provide and protect. Provide and protect. That's what every good man does. Now, it's really hard to stay in balance with all of that, because as we're young men and we're trying to feed a growing family, sometimes we can just spend all of our time providing and maybe not be home to protect the hearts of little ones. And then there's some guys who think, well, you know, I need to just be home and take care of my family, and I'll just let my wife do all the work. if she won't work when she's at home, if she won't work when she's in college, what makes you think she's going to work once you get married? And if he won't work, if he never takes flight, if he just lives in mom and dad's basement and plays video games till 3 in the morning, what do you think he's going to do when you get married? And so you want to look for people like Ruth, this hard-working woman who's coming to know the Lord and being loyal to the Lord and loyal to her mother-in-law. You watch about how a girl talks about her parents. Young ladies, you watch about how a young man talks about his parents. And you listen carefully. And so you see Boaz as a provider and a protector. But in the 2 minutes left, why is Ruth in the Bible? Who's the ultimate rescuer? Who's the ultimate provider? Who's the one who's going to come to the rescue of all of us? Well, it's going to be Jesus. He's going to be the deliverer. He's going to be the ultimate judge. He's going to be the king. He's going to be the priest. He's going to provide for his people. So where in your, and I hope you write that in the book of Judges, or excuse me, in the book of Ruth right there, what New Testament passage would you write at the top of your Bible at the beginning of Ruth? Maybe Matthew chapter 1. Let's just read that real quickly. Matthew chapter 1. And let's just notice, I think it's about verses 3 through 5. And there you're going to see the connection that Jesus is the one to whom we give our ultimate loyalty. And he's the one who's going to come from the seed of Boaz and Ruth. And he's going to be the one who will bless us. So picking up in verse 3, we've got Judah, who's the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram was the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz, watch this, Boaz by Rahab. Well, let that sit in for a minute. Somehow Rahab and Boaz are related. Did you think about that? Rahab was that harlot in Jericho, who comes to faith in Jesus. So Salmon's the father of Boaz by Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, Jesse's the father of David the king, which leads us to Jesus. So Jesus is the story of Ruth. All right? Thank you very much.